Welcome to our online Sunday experience and our November teaching series, How to Be Ordinary, Cultivating a Life of Depth and Simplicity Without Feeling Like a Failure. It's a practical 5-week series exploring the spiritual disciplines of solitude, silence, prayer, simplicity, and stability. The message you're about to hear was recorded live, and we hope it inspires you to join God in the renewal of all things.
Today we continue our new 5-part series entitled How to Be Ordinary, Cultivating a Life of Depth and Simplicity Without Feeling Like a Failure. As I mentioned last week, here's our map for this next month. Last week we talked about solitude. Today we'll talk a bit about silence. Starting next week we'll explore prayer, then simplicity, and finally stability. And the hope here is that you would experiment with and adopt these highly practical and accessible spiritual disciplines, especially during this upside-down season that we find ourselves in. So this week, we're going to build on where we started last week. Last week, we began to unpack the idea of solitude as something ordinary Christians practice. Here we could say that in solitude is where we make space to hear God. Now, the practice of silence will bring us one step deeper, another step inward. So if solitude makes room for God to speak, then silence makes room for us to listen. So to set the stage for where we're headed today, 2 ideas. First, Miles Davis, famed jazz writer, performer, and improviser, once said this about his performances. It's not the notes you play, it's the notes you don't play. So he's emphasizing what he's removing that actually makes the music better. Now add this idea from Chinese artist and activist Ai Weiwei. He says, silence is my music, or that intentional quiet or breaks or rests is something to be enjoyed. So keep all of that in mind as we jump into the book of 1 Kings, where we find the prophet Elijah surrounded by noise that puts him on the run for his life. Ready? Here we go. The word of the Lord came to him saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." And God said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle, went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? What are you doing here, Elijah? Why are you on the run, Elijah? Have you already forgotten the incredible ways that you have experienced me?" God says. If you're not familiar with the prophet Elijah or his story, here are some of his greatest hits, like incredible, spectacular moments where God made God's self so real and so tangible. There was this time where God miraculously provided for a widow and her son with unending oil and flour during a time of famine. Oh, and later on, he experienced God raise that same son from the dead. No big deal. No big deal at all. And then there was this time that Elijah was without food and ravens brought him lunch. Ravens! Oh, and there was this other time where God put on an incredible display of fire from the heavens that it consumed everything in sight. And there were 900 prophets of Baal at the same showdown, and God made his power and presence unmistakably felt. And so, after all of that, the question God asks of Elijah takes on fuller meaning. What are you doing here? On the run, Elijah. And so God puts on yet another dramatic display to jog Elijah's memory. But this time Elijah experiences God in a new way, not through the spectacular, but as the translation we just read puts it, God was in the sheer sound of silence. Your Bible might translate it as a still small voice or a light whisper. And some translations go so far as to describe this display as a gentle breeze. It's hard to pin down perfectly, but the contrast is clear. Sometimes God makes his presence felt in loud ways, and sometimes God reveals himself quietly. And the point for Elijah and for you and me is that God is using this moment of silence to get our attention. And not necessarily for the purpose of some intimate solace, but as a strengthening, a preparation. Because if you know the context of the story, you know what's coming next for Elijah. It's going to be a demanding confrontation. So we could describe this moment as a pregnant pause, a preparation for a coming significant moment, an anticipation and an expectation, an attention grabber that is born and cultivated in silence. And if that sounds a little out there to you, let's just bring it back down to earth. Here are some ways that we can think about the sound of sheer silence as a holy, pregnant pause. So let's start with science. Here are some article clips of what silence does to our brains. One study published in the journal Brain, Structure, and Function observed mice under the influence of noise and silence. Mice exposed to 2 hours of complete silence daily developed a peculiar side effect. They started to develop brand new cells in the hippocampus of the brain, the area which is associated with learning new things, retaining memory, and processing emotion. So you're saying that silence will make me smarter, help me remember things, and maybe be kinder? You don't say. There are many brain areas associated with emotional sensitivity and empathy. Particularly, the right supramarginal gyrus is an imperative brain region for the development of these traits. When we spend time in silence, this area of our brains, along with others which support empathy, are allowed to rest and reactivate, building higher levels of emphatic experience. So let me get this straight here. You're saying if someone practices silence, it cultivates this depth that allows me to respond to others in healthier ways? You don't say. Another important study has found that the brain processes information very differently when we allow it to be in silence. When the brain is at rest, meaning it is not exposed to new stimuli via sound, it can take both internal information, learn things, and integrate them more seamlessly with external information. So you're saying that silence helps cultivate this depth, will give me the ability to sort things out in life? Crazy. Which totally connects with another study treating dyslexia in kids, which revealed the following. The investigators found that the dyslexics made fewer errors when they read the text with increased spacing. In fact, their reading accuracy was improved by a factor of 2. And the worse the children were at identifying letters, the more they showed a benefit from the increased letter spacing. Ah, I love that so much. That actually also plays into what design theory has been saying for a long time, that you and I, when we read numbers and letters, what we're actually reading is the spaces in between the numbers and letters. Let me give you one more way to think about this. Listen to this short segment of Joseph Haydn's string composition titled The Joke. Now, pay attention to the feelings that the rests or pauses stir in you. And then pay attention to what happens right at the end. They thought it was over. After 7 full bars of nothing, the last notes are played. Did you feel that in the music? Did you feel the anticipation growing? Did you feel drawn in, that you were being prepared for what's next, this sense of expectation, all created by the silence? What is happening here? What's going to happen next? Right? You felt those feelings. You were drawn in. And so, for the follower of Jesus, the intentional practice of being silent creates that same effect. The quiet restores us, like the mice, and literally heals our minds. The space centers us and helps us sort out our jumbled lives, just like the kids suffering from dyslexia. And the rest prepares us and creates the sense of anticipation and expectation for what's next, just like the string quartet. So how does it do all of that? Well, let's go back to the story of Elijah for one last detail that I may have intentionally left out that provides some context for what happened to Elijah in the sheer sound of silence. I began reading in verse 9, but let's go back and read from verse 8. So Elijah got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, to you and I, that location doesn't mean much. But in context, it illuminates fresh meaning. And what is that context? Mount Horeb also goes by another name. What is that name? Mount Sinai. And why is that important? Well, Sinai is where God revealed himself to Moses. Sinai is where God sustained and provided for Israel during their wilderness wanderings. Sinai is where the Lord was met with, where Israel discovered in some detail what sort of God they served. And so for Elijah, it was like he was brought back to the beginning. Sinai was a reminder of what God had done, but now it was also a launching pad for what God was going to do. And all beginning with the sheer sound of silence. So for you and I, like Elijah, silence is a returning. For those of us who feel like we're on the run, silence is a welcoming back, a return to where you started with God. Silence is a reminder For those of us who need reminding, for those of us who, like Elijah, only remember trouble, silence is a reminder of who God is and what God has done. But silence is also rest. For those of us who, like Elijah, are hearing God speak the words, "What are you doing here?" Or, "What are you doing with your life?" Silence orients us. One author I read this week described silence as the first step into the future. Exactly. Silence is the pregnant pause that brings clarity of mind and heart. The sound of God's sheer silence builds expectation and anticipation for what God has next. And that, my friends, is what ordinary Christians do. We quiet down so that we can hear God.
So, how do we engage in silence? And how are silence and solitude different? Well, these practices are separate, but they are also intricately connected. So sometimes when we start talking about one, we also find that we are talking about the other. But as we layer silence onto solitude, we deepen the practice of aloneness. Silence serves to pry open solitude by removing noise and the distractions that we often are tempted to backfill our alone time with. We touched on this last week. We may have times of solitude baked into our week already, but in order to open those up to God, we have to be intentional about them. And one of the ways to be intentional about our times of solitude is to practice silence. For instance, I might be comfortable being by myself, but then fill the time I have by myself with noise or with busyness. And you can see how layering silence on top of that solitude would deepen and open it up, making it not just alone time, but time actually set apart to listen for God. I, in fact, do love alone time, and I spend a lot of energy guarding my alone time. But sometimes I also guard that alone time from God by keeping it busy and full and being distracted by other things. And so this week, I want to invite you to deepen your practice of solitude in a couple of different ways. First, take advantage of those times of solitude by silencing noise and minimizing distractions. Like we said last week, put your phone away, turn off the radio, and sit quietly. Enter into solitude through silence. But maybe you've grown up practicing solitude in the way that I have. I grew up in a Christian home, and part of my coming of age experience was that I was encouraged when I was old enough to have quiet time or devotional time. This was time that I was supposed to set apart to read my Bible and to pray. It was a great practice, and it formed me significantly as I was growing up. Maybe you had this same experience growing up, or maybe you've developed this same practice as an adult. It is a good one, and I am by no means encouraging you to discard it. If it's fruitful for you, keep it up. But I do want to acknowledge that sometimes the things that we do during these quiet times actually gets in the way of us engaging silence or quiet. These practices can become more techniques to avoid settling into quiet and maybe even to avoid God. Instead, we are engaging our reading and our agendas as we pray for what we need. And sometimes this serves to be a time that we just check things off our list instead of entering sacred space. So if this rings true for you, then I invite you to add into your time space to engage silence. Silence not only the noise of the world, but also the ways that you are tempted to manage your time of solitude. Don't journal, don't read, don't pray your list of requests. Instead, sink into the silence, wait, and listen. Again, journaling, reading your Bible, and praying your list of requests is a good thing. And it's especially good when it's something that is fruitful for you. And sometimes we need those things to give shape to our times of solitude, and that's okay. But silence is a different way of engaging solitude, and it might be something that you're longing for. Like the story of the prophet Elijah that Joe talked about, silence turns down the noise and activity and prepares us to hear from God. And it keeps us from imposing our own will on our times of solitude. Silence has the potential to help us connect with God at a place deeper than words, and some of us might be longing for that kind of connection. Now, just as silence cultivates the ground for us to hear God, it also opens up space for deep relationship with others. Silence extends beyond these times of solitude. In fact, the Bible has a plethora of warnings about how our words, when many, get us into trouble, are used to diminish others, or to control and manipulate others, or are used to manage our image and reputation. Periods of silence give us space and time to reflect on how we use our words, and then give us the ability to choose to use them to speak truth about ourselves and about others and about God. Silence also helps us practice holding our tongues so that we can do so in day-to-day life when words are not needed. So for instance, have you ever found yourself tuning out of a conversation because you're just waiting for your turn to speak? This keeps us from listening to others, from truly receiving what another person is saying to us. And over time, that undermines our relationships. Instead of using words to relate to one another and build community and empathy, our words become barriers to love and understanding because we use them to project ourselves, our own thoughts, our own ideas, rather than using them as tools for connection with others. You notice that you're doing this, especially in a specific environment or in a specific relationship. I invite you to intentionally enter that environment or that relationship with a conversation where the goal for you is not to say anything unless it is a response to what has been said by the other person. Instead of thinking about what you would like to say, focus on what is being said and how you might let the person you're listening to know that they've been heard, rather than letting them know what you're thinking. You know I'm saving your marriage and helping you raise your teenagers right now, right? Sometimes we use words to keep us from engaging the suffering of others in a real way. In the book of Job, we read the story of a man who is suffering greatly. For a while, his friends come and sit with him in silence, but eventually they can't hold their tongues anymore and they start to talk. They begin to try to solve Job's problems and to try to make sense of his suffering. If you've read the book, you'll know that at the end of the story, they receive a firm rebuke from God for doing so, because they've spoken about things they don't understand and offered platitudes in the place of compassion. Sometimes the best gift that we can give to someone else is our silent presence, to just listen, or to sit in silence with them if they don't want to speak. Silence can be the permission that we give to others to grieve, to struggle, and to wait for God. Silence is sometimes the most genuine response we can give to someone who is going through something for which there are just no words. So if you have someone in your life going through something for which you have no words, let your silence speak. So this week, your invitation is to silence. How can you turn off the distractions in your life in order to enter into times of solitude deeply and prepare to hear from God? And how can you offer your silence is the gift of attentiveness, compassion, and connection to one another.
Thanks for tuning in this week. If you need prayer, reach out to us at prayer@lakeviewchurch.com. And if you're new and you have questions, email us at new@lakeviewchurch.com. And if Lakeview is home for you, and if you believe in what God is up to in and through our church, we ask you would give as you are able at lakeviewchurch.com/give. See you next Sunday.